Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First of all today, let's talk about Brexit and the latest on those attempts to reach a deal ahead of next week's summit of EU leaders in Brussels. The post-mortem for just what went wrong yesterday, when many had predicted a breakthrough on the first part of the negotiations, including the tricky question of what to do about the Irish border, is in full swing. Blame has been spread widely to include everyone, it seems, the British government, the DUP, the Irish government and the EU for leaking the details and talking up the chances of a deal in the first place. Earlier this morning, the Chancellor Philip Hammond was asked what exactly had happened.
Well, look, we've been involved in a very complex negotiation that's been going on for some time. We have made a lot of progress over the last weeks. We've made tremendous steps forward. We are very close, but we're not there yet. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, we will have to do some further consultations, some further discussion today, and she expects to come back to Brussels later in the week. And in the meantime, we've got work to do.
Philip Hammond there. Well, we're joined here by someone who's been watching all of this more closely than is probably good for her health. It's the BBC's Laura Kunsberg. Welcome back from Brussels.
Thank you.
You've only just arrived, really, haven't you? What went wrong?
Well, there is a wide variety of interpretations in terms of what actually went wrong. In terms of the choreography, what went wrong is clearly the DUP, who Theresa May needs to get her Brexit legislation through the Commons, she relies on them, had not been consulted enough in order to be completely happy with the draft agreement that was changed, tweaked, worked on furiously over the weekend. So when Theresa May was sitting in her meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, pictured happily there behind you, at that point, over in Belfast, Arlene Foster and her colleagues in the DUP came waltzing down the stairs at the Stormont Assembly and said basically they weren't happy with it, at which point Theresa May had to leave her meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker to have a private one-on-one phone call with Arlene Foster, during the course of which I understand Ms Foster basically said, we can't put up with this. Theresa May had to go back into the meeting and tell Jean-Claude Juncker that in terms of yesterday at least, it was off. Now, how we got to that point, there are lots of different versions of events, and I'm sure we can talk about those in a moment.
Right. I mean, and we'll talk about the substance of why they're
absolutely
not happy with it in just a moment. But first of all, it is quite extraordinary that Theresa May had to come out of that meeting to talk to the DUP, as you say, who prop up Theresa May in this instance. Whose fault was that the DUP had not been properly consulted?
Well, fingers are being pointed in different directions. So it's been suggested to me that the newish Chief Whip had assured the Prime Minister that the DUP was squared off, and that proved not to be the case. It's also been put to me that actually this is all the fault of officials in Number 10, Ollie Robbins, who has not got the political nous to understand that this was not going to be politically acceptable. One does then wonder what the Prime Minister herself was making of it and why she thought it might be political acceptable. And her critics would suggest that actually it's because she's too much of a manager and a technocrat, not in fact somebody with real political nous at her fingertips. Of course, there are also fingers being pointed at the European Union for pushing Ireland too hard, and Ireland pushing the UK too hard towards a solution where they were making all of these demands on having these kinds of assurances in black and white that were never going to be acceptable to their cousins across the Irish border in the north. In terms of who's officially to blame, well, of course, no one, because the talks go on, there's a bit more work to do, and that'll all be fine by Friday.
Let's talk about the substance of why the DUP ended up being so unhappy, because this is about something called regulatory alignment.
Great phrase.
It is a great phrase, just trips off the tongue and means probably very little to a lot of us. But really it means Northern Ireland being treated the same as the rest of the UK, and they don't want to be treated any differently, except there are things that they do in common with Ireland.
That's right.
Issues that have been agreed in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
So what is it that they were so unhappy about?
Well, as you suggest, it's a principle for the DUP. They do not want Brexit to mean that Northern Ireland in any way looks less British than the rest of the United Kingdom. That's their reason for being. They're a unionist party. However, as you say, there are issues on which they already have lots of cooperation with the Irish government, water, animal welfare, things like that. There's already a lot of cooperation there. What they were unhappy about yesterday was the extent to which this proposed deal implied, really, that in future Northern Ireland would be more closely tied to the EU in some areas than it would be potentially to the UK. So as the UK strikes out on its own, maybe changing the rules and regulations, that's the point of Brexit after all, Northern Ireland wouldn't be able to do that, and therefore the paths of the two parts of the United Kingdom would be splitting. But why this is so sort of neuralgic, why this is so toxic, is because this is really, in some ways, a proxy for the debate that's happening inside the Tory party. What kind of Brexit are we going to end up with? Are we going to end up with the kind of vision that Philip Hammond would like to see, where to make things easy and stable for business, basically we stick pretty closely to the European Union, we mirror what's happening? Or are we going to end up with the kind of Brexit where we do really strike out on our own? We are much more able to make changes as we see fit. So it's a principle for the unionists, but it's also so difficult here at Westminster because it presses on the bruise of the fight that's actually been going on in the Tory party for months now. And it's been suggested to me this morning that it may get to the point where there's pressure on her to walk. One senior Tory party said to me, if the EU is not prepared to bury this for now, to postpone the Irish issue until the second phase, Theresa May ought to walk out from the talks.
Vince Cable, negotiations like these, despite what some people said, were always going to be complicated. You've got to get so many people on side. But isn't this just part and parcel of what happens? And actually, a deal is still possible before Christmas.
Well, we're not talking about a final deal.
No, I mean a deal to move on to the next stage.
Moving from the foothills to the real mountains. But actually, this is a mess on several levels. I mean, you've got a party that accounts for 1% of the British public, which doesn't even represent the majority in Northern Ireland, effectively holding the government to ransom. And I think all the points that Laura's just made, I mean, there is a lot of just sheer incompetence. And I think the one way in which British public mood is changing, I mean, their overall assessment of Brexit hasn't changed, but the one way in which public mood is changing is to feel that the government is handling this very, very badly.
Right, but they're not changing their mind on Brexit, are they?
Not yet, but we haven't yet seen what the outcome is. The one thing that is very striking, and the Survation poll in the Mail on Sunday made this very clear, is we now have a significant margin, about 16%, of those people who think that there ought to be a referendum on the final deal. That was not the case before. We put that case in June in the election, didn't win that argument.
No, but you don't seem to have improved your position in the polls as a result.
It is now moving strongly in that direction.
Can I just come back to this issue, though, of other parts of the party, of the Tory party, that actually have jumped to some extent on the bandwagon? You've got Ruth Davidson, very influential, obviously, in her role in Scotland, saying, well, why don't we just do the same for the whole of the UK in terms of aligning ourselves more closely to the EU? And, of course, Nicola Sturgeon saying something similar. We've had on the Labour side Sadiq Khan. Now, you can see there could be more pressure and an attempt to have what we used to call a soft Brexit.
That's right. And, you know, the one solution, one former minister in government was saying to me yesterday, not one of the usual suspects, Remainers, was saying to me yesterday, technically, it would be really easy to fix all of this. You just say, fine, we stay in the customs union. The difficulty for Theresa May is she's ruled that out, and maybe half, maybe even 2/3 of the 1922 of the Tory backbenchers just wouldn't accept that. So there is there potentially a solution, but that would of course have consequences for how we could strike free trade agreements. That would undermine potentially a lot of the possible opportunities that come after we leave the European Union. So it is fiendishly difficult, but in a sense you're seeing Theresa May's red lines that seem sort of so limited, and so many of them have already faded to pink, in fact, but her kind of political box that she has built herself means that rather than being able to sort of make bold offers, she's very much hemmed in. But I think also someone was sort of pulling their hair out this morning saying the thing is she's got to understand she's not going to to be able to please everybody.
Yes. So the question is, who is she prepared to let go?
Make most cross.
Will there be a deal? That's really,
well, look, it's still possible. I mean, this is what I was going to say. It is still the case that the fundamental here is that all sides want there to be a deal. It is also the case that while it would be very politically inconvenient and not what Number 10 wants, December isn't the last chance. OK, it is feasible that this could go until March. It's not what the EU wants. It's not what the British government wants. But some people think, well, why not? What is the rush? Because part of the problem here is the time pressure. Now, for others, CBI, business groups would be appalled by that because they're worried about investment decisions being delayed. But it certainly is possible. And if suddenly the DUP come back on board by the end of the week, the politics will have a completely different complexion yet again.
Yes, well, we look forward to that. Thank you very much, Laura. Let's pause now briefly for our daily quiz. The question for today is, which party leader has taken part in a charity Christmas song singing the Mariah Carey classic, All I Want for Christmas? Is it A, my guest of the day, Vince Cable; B, the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon; C, the DUP's Arlene Foster; or D, UKIP's Henry Bolton? And at the end of the show, Vince will hopefully give us the correct answer, or maybe sing along too. Now,
can I tell you?
No, not until the end of the show. You can come back then. Let's pick up now where we left off very briefly on Brexit. We knew there would be plenty of shuttle diplomacy needed during these negotiations with the EU, and Theresa May has plenty more people to try and get on side in the coming weeks. This morning she held a meeting of the Cabinet where she will have had to explain why a deal hasn't been agreed. Convention is that the Prime Minister addresses Parliament after any significant EU meeting. She won't be speaking to MPs today, but there will be an urgent question on the subject in the Commons, which Brexit Secretary David Davis will respond to. Theresa May needs to ease unionist concerns that Northern Ireland could have a separate status within the UK under a future deal. But it's unclear whether there will be any talks with DUP leader Arlene Foster today. She could then skip Prime Minister's questions to head back to Brussels as early as tomorrow to resume talks with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. The Prime Minister is under pressure to get an agreement on EU divorce issues before European leaders meet next Thursday to decide if enough progress has been made to start talks on post-Brexit trade. And, of course, that doesn't just include the tricky question of the Irish border, but also whether the European Court of Justice will have jurisdiction over EU citizens in the UK after Brexit, and for how long. Both sides say they're optimistic a deal can still be reached, but it has to be agreed by the EU, including Ireland, the Democratic Unionist Party's 10 MPs, who Theresa May relies on for her majority, and the rest of the Conservative Party. And to help us make sense of why yesterday's talks failed to break the impasse on the status of the Irish border, I'm joined now by Ali Renison, Head of Trade and Brexit Policy at the Institute of Directors. Ali, thank you for joining us here at the Daily Politics. We talked briefly just a moment ago about regulatory divergence and continued regulatory alignment. What's the difference?
I think the tendency is to look at that this is a sort of discussion about semantics, although if you were to really sort of peel back some of the layers, when you talk about avoiding divergence, I think that allows you, sort of leads you down the path of concluding that this would be ensuring that the UK is more in step with EU rules governing the single market, i.e. more along the lines of Norway, and regulatory alignment allows a bit more flexibility. Some might call it room for fudge or interpretation, but would obviously depend on a very unprecedented level of regulatory cooperation between the UK, the EU, Ireland, and those parties involved.
Right. So do you think this is an attempt to fudge it by changing the language and the semantics of the text?
I think it was always a question about how much you were going to get conclusively resolved relating to the Irish border in phase one. You know, the concern, I think, from businesses now, and while those of us who deal in policy are obviously following day by day, hour by hour what's going on, I think most businesses are really looking at this and saying, as long as we get over the line next week, that's all that matters. Because, and I think it's important for all parties, including the Irish government, to remember that if we don't get sufficient progress next week, I think the noise for walking off without a deal becomes very, very loud indeed. So that's the most important thing that people are looking at. And they will, I'm actually pretty optimistic when I hear people like Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk say that they feel confident about getting a deal, because in the past, when they haven't felt confident, they've said that.
Right. Was it too optimistic to expect an agreement yesterday?
Well, we don't know. We're not privy to all the different ins and outs of the conversations and the various texts that were being drafted. It's not clear to what extent all parties involved that would have a say were being consulted in advance, obviously. So that's a question. I think we saw people in the Commission saying today that the show now is in London. So that is obviously reflective of the fact that there needs to be some discussion about, you know, where is it that the UK wants to head generally. And I think for better or for worse, what the last 24 to 48 hours have shown is that that discussion about what does the UK want as a whole in terms of regulatory relationship with the EU is suddenly being brought forward.
I mean, how much detail, as you said, can be done at this stage? Or are we expecting the individual parties, whether it's the Irish government or the DUP or the Conservative Party, to take on trust the broad outline at this stage before you can move on?
Well, you often hear when you're in Brussels discussion about the importance of the UK government conveying that trust and goodwill, and that has happened in the past through the speeches that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, has made in Florence. You saw the sort of the money issue move after that. So I think what the Irish government is probably looking for is a roadmap, they say, to sort of showing that no matter what happens, the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, the North-South cooperation that exists currently will be protected. And as long as there is sort of enough trust to show that that is what the UK intends to do, then perhaps we can leave a lot of the practical discussions for phase 2, because that's really where it feels at the moment that we're just dancing around all these issues that cannot really be separated from discussions about future arrangements overall.
Ali Renison, thank you very much. Well, we're joined here by the Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng. He's also an aide to Chancellor Philip Hammond for Labour, the Shadow Brexit spokesperson Jenny Chapman, and of course Vince Cable is our guest of the day as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Kwasi Kwarteng, should the DUP have been properly consulted and informed about the deal the Prime Minister was about to sign up to yesterday?
Well, I think that the whole point of a negotiation and the Prime Minister's conversation was that it was only really at the end of that process that they came up with a formula of words. And of course, you can't inform people of the formula of words you're going to come up with before you've actually started the negotiation. I think that there was a misunderstanding. I understand from various blogs that one journalist from Ireland made a tweet about what the nature of the deal was, and the DUP essentially reacted to that. But it's clear to me that we can definitely get a deal. As the Chancellor said this morning, he's very confident of the deal. And also, as your interlocutor said just now, both Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker are very optimistic about getting a deal. And I think that's something that we can celebrate. But
Kwasi Kwarteng, Theresa May was in the meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, having lunch with him.
That's right.
And the DUP, Sammy Wilson, has said any attempt to placate Dublin and the EU could mean a withdrawal of DUP support for the government. Why didn't they know what was being agreed?
Because, as far as I understand, there was a leak from the lunch or whatever it was, the statement that they were going to make, which had come out, and they reacted in the way that they did.
But should there have been exchange of papers? I mean, your colleague Owen Paterson has said it's extraordinary that there wasn't an exchange of official papers between the DUP and the government.
I don't see it in the way that Owen does at all.
But that's why they're not supporting it. So they've scuppered this agreement.
Before we get very excited about this, I'm very confident that a deal will be made, and I'm also very confident that the DUP will be able to agree to the terms of any future deal that we have.
What gives you that confidence? What's going to change then? What's the government going to do to get the DUP on board?
I think the DUP have said, and the government has said, that they want Northern Ireland to be treated as a whole with the rest of the UK. And that's something that the DUP and the Conservative Party is committed to. It's a Conservative and Unionist party for point of information.
Right, so was it a mistake to talk about regulatory alignment then between Ireland and Northern Ireland?
I think that regulatory alignment wouldn't be a deal breaker for me. The DUP clearly had an issue with that, and we're going to have to come up with a more specific formula of words to please them. I completely understand that. That's how negotiation and diplomacy is conducted.
But it's not just a form of words, is it? There's going to have to be a decision by the government as to whether they are going to align Northern Ireland with the EU more closely, which the DUP has said no to. And if they don't do that, then the Irish government isn't going to agree, because they thought yesterday we're going to have regulatory equivalence between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
But equivalence isn't the same as alignment. I don't want to get into a semantic debate. I mean, clearly regulatory alignment is different from regulatory equivalence, and we can do a deal based on the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU. I think that's eminently achievable.
Right. Do you think a deal is possible? It seems that actually this can be squared, and it was about people leaking details too soon yesterday.
I think it's shocking
what
happened yesterday. What happened yesterday was embarrassing for the country. It is extraordinary that the Prime Minister didn't keep the DUP informed. I spoke to the DUP last night and again this morning informally, and they're very cross that they felt that they weren't respected and included and kept informed, and they felt that the Conservative Party hadn't really got to know them. But I think they feel they do now. And the Prime Minister needs to take this a very, very different approach. She seems to have this attitude on many occasions, actually, where she wants to do deals privately, but she falls short on the aspects of it which are around communication and in bringing people with her. And that's a very important quality when you're talking about this kind of negotiation.
Right, well, we'll come on to the substance in a moment, but so it was mishandled,
I think
completely
what you
mishandled,
said-
and the DUP are very cross.
I actually think what you said in the question to the Labour representative was right. I think it was a question of a tweet. It was a question of leaked statements which were slightly misinterpreted.
So we lose a deal on the back of a tweet, Kwasi? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that, but you
are
understand.
saying that.
But you understand.
Well, the practical result has been is the deal hasn't been done.
No, Jenny will understand that we live in a social media age where things are tweeted all the time.
Well, the Prime Minister ought to
people
understand
react,
that too.
And people react all the time to that. I
Was
think
the
we're
number
very
10,
close-
did the
I
number
think we're
10
very close
operation
to a deal.
fail to come up to the standards
we were
here?
very close to a deal. I think a deal is still eminently achievable and is far more likely than not. And I think we will have made significant progress because all these people, Vince and Jenny, were saying that it was never going to happen. They were doomsayers right from the start.
No.
They never thought we would get a deal.
No,
and I think it's
that
a
is not
real
true.
credit to the government that we're going to achieve a deal in the time that
Right, well, let me answer that. Isn't that what you did say, that this is a mess?
Well, you don't
just
even
a moment
believe in
ago?
Brexit. You want to stay in the EU.
Hang on, let Vince
We
answer.
haven't got a deal yet. But on the two big areas where the government claims it has got an agreement, which are on the rights of citizens on the money, basically it's happened because the British government has signed up to what the European Union asked for a year ago. I mean, this is... they knew exactly what was coming down the track. And on the Irish question, Jenny's right. I mean, it was terribly incompetent. But underneath the incompetence, there is a fundamental problem of difference. You either have a hard border or you don't. This isn't a question of nuance and language. You may well get some agreement on regulatory convergence or divergence, which is about the single market, but the basic issue of freedom of movement across the frontier, but through trade, which is a customs union issue, has not been resolved. It hasn't even been confronted yet.
Yeah, but
These are massive problems.
But you will know that it wasn't part of the first phase of the discussion. You said that
So why
yourself
have you ruled
earlier.
it out?
You said that earlier yourself in this.
Right, well, let's clear up Labour's position here, because do you agree, Jenny Chapman, with Ruth Davidson, who says if regulatory alignment in a number of specific areas is the requirement for a frictionless border, then the Prime Minister should conclude this must be on a UK-wide basis. Should we stay in the customs union?
I completely agree with Ruth on saying we need to deal with this on a UK-wide basis. We cannot have separate deals for bits of the United Kingdom.
Right.
So yes on that.
So should we stay in the customs
We
union?
would not have ruled out membership of the customs union in the way that the Prime Minister has, and I am sure she now regrets that because she has boxed herself in. And by taking that off the table, which is something that the Labour Party would not have done, and we would have kept the customs union not just on the table, but we would have wanted it for the transition period as well.
So what would your deal look like? What would your deal look like at this stage, though,
yesterday.
Jenny Chapman, if you don't even know whether you would have been in or out of the customs union?
We would keep it on the table.
Yeah, but how could you do an agreement then?
Because if she'd
What would
wanted-
you have agreed
because
yesterday?
yesterday we don't need to have the full details agreed. What we need
You do need to know if you want to be in the customs union or you want to be outside it.
what she could have said is we are not ruling out membership of the customs union.
Sorry, I don't understand. I mean,
it's-
Vince Cable's position is clear. You want to stay in the customs union and in the single market. So that is a clear position. You may not like it or not. And
My
the
position is
Conservatives
clear.
here under Kwasi Kwarteng are saying we must be outside the customs union, we must be outside the single market. Again, you may not agree with it. And Labour's position is we're not sure.
No, Labour's position is that we would keep it on the table and we would negotiate from that position. This is a negotiation. This is not a situation where Theresa May can turn up in Brussels and say, this is what I want, this is what I must have.
But you have criticised the government because you've said that we do need to know what the government actually wants, and they've said what they want.
What she needs to do is to go to Brussels and say we are not ruling out the customs union, which could be the solution to not just the future of jobs and trade for the whole of the UK, but solves this absolutely critical issue of the Irish border. And people who are saying, like Kwasi, that we want to be out of the customs union cannot answer how you solve the Irish border.
Right.
They're prepared
it's true,
to
though, isn't
sacrifice
it? That is the solution. And actually, what would you say if Theresa May, in the end, agrees that that is the only way to solve this problem, is to say we are going to stay in some sort of customs union in order to have that frictionless border?
I think you put it very well. I think Vince's position is very clear.
Answer my question.
My position is clear. I think we've got to come out of the customs union and out of the single market.
So you're not prepared to negotiate on that at all?
The issue about the customs union is that if we stay in the customs union, we will not be able to strike bilateral deals with any other country. And that's very, very important. That's a very important part of Britain's sovereignty and a part of our opportunities. The Labour position is as clear as mud, frankly, on all of these issues. I respect Vince's position because he has a clarity. He thinks we should never have left and we should stay in the EU forever and a day, as far as I can work out. But what I am saying is that we're going to leave, and we're going to leave both.
What's your view of Labour's position? Is that a more nuanced position? Would that have worked in these negotiations, saying we won't rule out staying in the customs union?
Well, I was disappointed by the lack of clarity, as you obviously were. But the point is, we need to know what the end point is. I mean, if you go into a negotiation, is the objective to stay in or go out? And I think we're reasonably clear where we need to be. But I think unless the Labour Party make it absolutely clear that at the end of the transition, are you going to be in the single market and the customs union or not? That question has to be answered.
And that is what we would be negotiating. But our starting point would be very, very different. Well, we want a solution that solves the Irish border and that protects jobs in the economy in the whole of the UK.
But doesn't actually amount to Brexit.
We don't want a solution that treats different parts of the UK differently. Now, with the best will in the world, it's not the Labour Party who are negotiating in Brussels.
But does that mean you shouldn't have a clear position?
Well, we do have a clear position that takes us through this negotiation phase and through transition, which most people seem to estimate would be about 2 years. Now, that's not bad in terms of clarity from a party that isn't actually in the negotiations, and we would have handled yesterday a hell of a lot better than we saw from the Tory party.
But as Vince
All right,
said,
let me just ask Kwasi Kwarteng on the European Court of Justice. Do you want to see an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on EU citizens' rights in the UK after Brexit?
I would like to see an end to the overall jurisdiction of the ECJ. That was one of the things. Well, this is what we're negotiating. I suspect at the end of the transition period in 21. Or I don't see it in 2019 because I think we are going to have a transition period, but certainly by the end of this Parliament we should be out of their jurisdiction, and that's very clear, I think, part of the whole debate about Brexit.
Right. I can just tell you that I think we've heard that Theresa May is going to be speaking to both Arlene Foster, the head of the DUP, and Michelle O'Neill for Sinn Féin later on today, obviously to try and get further agreement. Beyond transition, would you accept any jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on EU citizens' rights?
No, I want full British sovereignty. I want full sovereignty of the United Kingdom. And I think we've got perfectly good human rights record. We've got a very good judicial system that's respected all around the world. And I think the rights of the EU citizen here will be confirmed by our own courts.
Right,
but
and isn't that possible?
Well, it's fine as far as it goes, but we're not just talking about EU citizens here, are we? We're talking about British citizens on the continent. And where do they go? Where do they get redress should they have an issue? We're saying, if you take Kwasi's position, that the ECJ would not have access to the ECJ to resolve anything. And that, it just seems to be a red line that was put there for ideological reasons by the Prime Minister to keep people like Kwasi on side early on in the process.
And
I suspect she probably wishes that she hadn't been quite so emphatic about that.
All right. If there is no deal, if there is no agreement, I shouldn't use the word deal, if there's no agreement at this stage before moving on to phase 2 by December, should the Prime Minister walk away?
I think that we've always, in any negotiation, should be prepared to walk away. That's the whole point. I mean, that was one of the reasons why David Cameron got into the muddle that he did, because it was clear to his interlocutors that he wasn't prepared to walk away. I actually think that the chances of deal are very high.
You've said that.
And I also think that if it doesn't come to fruition this month, we've got till March.
Right,
obviously,
so you are
that's not
saying
ideal.
you should wait
that's
until March,
ideal.
You wouldn't walk away.
Ultimately, you should always have the ability to walk away from any negotiation. That's the whole point of a negotiation. I do think that we're so close that we should maybe give it a little bit more time in order to get a deal.
Right. Just before I let you go, should the DUP be calling the shots in the way they do?
I don't think they're particularly calling the shots. They have 10 MPs. We know that we rely on them for a parliamentary majority, but it's very much the Prime Minister and the Conservative government. There are no government ministers in the DUP that are driving this. But
they don't represent the majority in Northern Ireland. They have 1%.
They don't,
and,
and we will talk a little bit more about your position, and we can bring that up then in terms of Brexit. But thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Theresa May is under growing pressure to find a way forward after Brexit talks broke down yesterday over the future of Northern Ireland. A deal on this first phase of negotiations has to be in place before next week's summit so talks can move on to trade. Labour has called Theresa May's efforts an embarrassment. Now, former Tory leader Ian Duncan-Smith says it's nearly time to walk away from the talks, as our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports.
You can shake hands as much as you like.
Prime Minister, are you confident of a deal?
But it doesn't mean there'll be a deal. The Spanish leader, only one of the dozens she has to get on side.
There are still a couple of issues we need to work on, but we'll be reconvening in Brussels later this week.
But it's this band she needs right now. The Democratic Unionist Party's 10 MPs, feeling their power in every step.
Well, good afternoon, folks.
Who refused to back Theresa May's deal in Brussels yesterday over Ireland's border. Their fear it would send Northern Ireland on a different path to the rest of the UK.
Clearly the text that we were shown very late yesterday morning did not translate what we had been told in general conversations into reality.
Would you be willing to see the deal fail?
We don't want to see the talks fail, and we don't want to see an outcome where there's no deal. We want to see a sensible Brexit.
It's not a done deal, never too late.
Yesterday's collapse provoked arguments on all sides, with some believing Scotland, Wales or some sectors of the economy should all get special status now. But in Dublin, one clear message: no budging. Clinging to the agreement that the North and South would mirror each other's rules and regulations in future.
The ball is in London's court. The Prime Minister and the European Commission, the negotiating teams, have asked for more time. I understand that the Prime Minister is managing many difficulties.
Number 10 still believes it could be back on by the end of the week. Sorted, certainly, by Christmas. But the failure yesterday meant a barrage of attacks in the Commons.
What an embarrassment. If the price of the Prime Minister's approach is the break-up of the Union and reopening of bitter divides in Northern Ireland, then the price is too high.
The suggestion that we might depart the European Union but leave one part of the United Kingdom behind, still inside the single market and customs union. That is emphatically not something that the UK government is considering.
Confident of a deal, Mr Johnson?
But there's no agreement yet at Cabinet about the specifics of what happens next. And there's brooding unhappiness among some Brexiteers about what's being promised. The former leader telling the BBC it might be time to walk away.
This is a game being played out over power. And the answer at the end, it boils down to who will call the shots on this. And right now, we have to say, not good enough. We simply cannot pay this price.
You're saying to Brussels, back off or we'll walk?
Well, I think the statement is even more straightforward. You need to change this process and to back off. Otherwise, we get on with other arrangements.
The Prime Minister and the DUP are yet to talk directly today. Theresa May is not in total control of her relationships with her friends or rivals. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's talk to our Ireland correspondent, Chris Buckler, who's in Stormont for us now. This border issue, Chris, it's turning out to be hugely complex. I mean, what are the prospects of finding a solution?
Well, on the one hand, everybody has the same goal. Nobody wants a hard border, customs posts springing up on this island. But how you achieve that, well, they cannot agree. And the Irish government, as Laura was saying, are very determined that they had a deal that saw no regulatory differences between the two parts of this island, between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But the DUP say that they won't accept any differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Now, one solution that's been put forward by, among others, the Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, is for the whole UK to stick to some of those rules and regulations that the EU will have going forward. But there are some within the government who are deeply against that because it could tie their hands in the trade talks that they are desperately trying to get to. Meanwhile, all of this has left relationships between Belfast and Dublin deeply antagonistic. The DUP accusing the Irish government of putting Anglo-Irish relationships in all kinds of jeopardy, and they are only getting worse. They've even accused the Irish government of stopping British negotiators from letting them see the controversial text of that proposed deal. As a result, there is going to be a very close focus on whatever words are put forward in the future. You do get the impression tonight that Theresa May is now involved in two Brexit negotiations, one with the EU and one with the DUP.
Chris, thank you very much.
Theresa May appears no closer tonight to breaking the deadlock over a Brexit deal that would finally allow trade talks to start with the EU. The Brexit Secretary David Davis today insisted the plan to give special status to Northern Ireland would apply to the whole of the UK. But Labour branded the failed agreement an embarrassment, and the Irish border issue remains unsolved. Here's our political correspondent, Paul Brand.
Theresa May had a smile for the Spanish Prime Minister today.
Prime Minister, are you confident of a deal?
Right now, the tough talk is with allies closer to home. Their meeting was a little stilted while they waited for the interpreter.
El Reino Unido y España.
But it's Northern Ireland who she's really lost in translation, as our Prime Minister tries to find the words to get Brexit back on track.
Our talks with the European Union have made a lot of progress. There are still a couple of issues we need to work on, but we'll be reconvening in Brussels later this week.
Mr. Speaker, what an embarrassment.
Labour had a different spin on it after the DUP pulled the government's Brexit deal, not happy it gave special treatment to Northern Ireland.
It's one thing, Mr. Speaker, to go to Brussels and fall out with those on the other side of the negotiating table. It's quite another to go to Brussels and fall out with those supposedly on your own side of the negotiating table. The DUP tail is wagging the Tory dog.
The suggestion that we might depart the European Union but leave one part of the United Kingdom behind, still inside the single market and customs union. That is emphatically not something that the UK government is considering.
But yesterday there was an idea to align regulations between Northern Ireland and the Republic to avoid a hard border. The DUP rejected that, worried it'd separate their country from the rest of the UK. Now the government seems to want the whole of the UK to be aligned with the Republic to avoid any divisions. Tonight the Prime Minister is expected to phone the DUP, which props up her government. They only wish she'd been in touch sooner, but blame Ireland for cutting them out.
We only received written text late yesterday morning that it was clearly unacceptable in its current form. And we also issue a warning today to the Dublin government that by continuing its aggressive stance, they are in danger of delivering for themselves the very outcomes that they say they want to avoid.
With time short, the Prime Minister could meet EU leaders as early as tomorrow, but our Brexit deal may not be scuppered in Brussels, but in Britain. Paul Brand, ITV News, Westminster.
Well, the Irish Prime Minister said today the ball is now firmly in Mrs May's court, and the Republic's Brexit negotiator told ITV News they've compromised over the border issue, and now the DUP must do that too. Well, Juliet Bremner is in Dublin for us tonight. So Juliet, both sides, it seems, then remaining firm.
Yes, the blame game is well and truly underway, but there's a determination here in Dublin that the Irish government won't be cast as the bad guys in this drama. They admit that the whole Brexit process has strained relations between North and South, but say they have given a great deal. And one of the main negotiators told me today that they couldn't be pushed to give any more.
A hard Brexit is an absolute disaster for everyone. The UK particularly, and Northern Ireland especially. No one wants that, but we're not going to be bullied and forced into jumping the gun here. We have to get decent agreement in order to allow us to move on to phase 2, and I'm very, very hopeful that we will get that at the next council meeting.
That bullying reference was definitely intended and aimed at the DUP. He went on to tell me that the DUP are not the only voice in Northern Ireland, and if there was still a power-sharing executive, there would be a cross-community voice. There is a feeling here in Ireland that they don't really have a place at the negotiating table, and they're urging Mrs May to do whatever she needs to do to try and get to a resolution without the voice of the DUP in her ear.
Juliet Bremner in Dublin, thank you. And our political editor Robert Peston is in Downing Street. So Robert, can the Prime Minister then rescue any sort of a deal on Brexit?
Well, she hasn't got long, as I reliably understand it. She has to get this sorted by Sunday, because if it's not sorted by Sunday, the EU President Donald Tusk cannot circulate the proposals to EU governments in time for a decision to be made at the next summit. So There really isn't long. The Prime Minister is absolutely clear that her top priority is reassuring the whole world that she does not want a hard border reintroduced between Northern Ireland and the Republic, because she understands the concerns that that could lead to a breakdown of peace, to a resumption of terrorism. But as of now, they are quite some distance for coming up with a form of words that would satisfy both the Northern Ireland DUP party, which are propping her up in power, and Dublin. And so I think this is going to be possibly the most challenging 48 hours of her career as Prime Minister.
Right, Robert Peston in Downing Street, thank you.
As the Brexit talks continued behind some very closed doors in Brussels, Labour turned on the government here, calling it an embarrassment. Sir Keir Starmer said that by preventing Theresa May from concluding a deal with the EU yesterday, the DUP tail was wagging the Tory dog. Today, Democratic Unionist MPs in Westminster insisted that they had acted to protect the integrity of the United Kingdom. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Yesterday, their leader phoned the Prime Minister as she was about to sign off the Brexit divorce agreement, and everything was stalled. Today, the DUP's MPs said what their objections had been.
What matters is the text. What matters are the words that are used in text and in international treaties and agreements. That when you translate red lines into text, the text has got to reflect what is the red lines.
Stop Brexit! It's not a done deal!
They could hardly complain. The DUP started out decades ago as a party of street protest. Yesterday, they dashed the possibility of a diplomatic breakthrough from the Prime Minister's hands. Today, she was hosting the Spanish Prime Minister and putting a brave face on things.
Our talks with the European Union have made a lot of progress. There are still a couple of issues we need to work on, but we'll be reconvening in Brussels later this week.
To do that, she'll have to rewrite passages in the draft agreement or do a better job selling them to her DUP partners. At the heart of it all, how do you keep the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland seamless? Something you have to draw on to see when there are two different customs zones either side after Brexit. The Brexit secretary told the Commons the draft agreement was right to say you need regulatory alignment. He spelt out what he meant.
Alignment isn't harmonisation. It isn't having exactly the same rules. It's sometimes having mutually recognised rules, mutually recognised inspection, all of that sort of thing as well. That's what we're aiming at.
Yesterday, though, Ireland's Prime Minister was putting it differently.
When it comes to avoiding regulatory divergence or maintaining regulatory alignment, those two things mean the same in our view.
So outside on the Green, did the DUP see alignment as a secret plot to keep them in the single market after Brexit, or something they could yet sign up to?
David Davis said in the House, regulatory alignment is not a phrase to be frightened of. It doesn't mean harmonisation. Do you agree?
Well, Northern Ireland already has a single energy market with the Irish Republic, so there are areas where we can cooperate with the Irish Republic, and indeed where it may make sense to have some kind of regulatory alignment in certain specific areas, but not in relation to the following the rules of the single market or the customs union for Northern Ireland as a generality.
Back in the Commons, Labour said the time had come to consider staying in the single market as well as the customs union. Sir Keir Starmer said Theresa May's approach was falling apart, an embarrassment.
It's one thing, Mr. Speaker, to go to Brussels and fall out with those on the other side of the negotiating table. It's quite another to go to Brussels and fall out with those supposedly on your own side of the negotiating table.
So how serious is that fallout? Can things be patched up with the DUP?
Knowing what you know, would you be astonished if there was a deal before the end of this week?
Would I be astonished? I've learned not to be astonished at anything in politics anymore. Thank you.
The government's hoping it can win back the DUP and do it this week. But the glare of the spotlight has now been shone on language carefully chosen for its ambiguity. And that never helps.
Stop Brexit! It's not a done deal! Stop!
Well, the Prime Minister had let it be known that she was thinking she might just get back to Brussels tomorrow to pick up where she left off yesterday. I understand the likelihood of her actually making a trip to Brussels Wednesday is receding pretty fast, and Thursday would be the earliest. Nothing's guaranteed about that. Is it looking as though this whole thing can be put back together again? Well, one of the most important things to remember here is that the whole idea of continued regulatory alignment, that phrase, was that this wasn't part of Britain's sort of idea mapping out of where the end state where they thought things would end up. This was, as one Whitehall source put it to me, a parking exercise. This was a fallback position if there was no deal. That's one of the few things we definitely know about the 15-page document that Theresa May was thinking of signing off on. So you'd think if that's all it is, just a few words, as it were, to help Britain get through to phase 2, you'd think the whole thing was put back together again a bull. And it's not at all clear that it is, though. You've got Europe, you've got Northern Ireland, two incredibly potent and volatile chemical mixes. So we just have to wait.
Gary Gibbon. Well, from the House of Commons now, I'm joined by the Conservative MP and former Northern Ireland Secretary Owen Paterson. With me in the studio, Alistair Campbell, former Director of Communications with Tony Blair and part of his inner circle during the Good Friday Agreement negotiations. Owen Paterson, if they can't square this circle, we're heading for a hard Brexit, and that's a disaster, isn't it?
No, not at all. We all very much hope that we will get onto trade talks, and what we'd much prefer to see would be reciprocal trade with zero tariffs. That would be much the best solution. But the EU has been stringing us along, demanding more and more money, demanding, in my opinion, unacceptable demands that the ECJ still has a remit after Brexit Day.
So you'd put up a border in Northern Ireland?
No, let me answer the question. No, there is absolutely no need for a hard border. There is a border at the moment. There is a currency border. There is a tax border. There is an excise duty border. I've been going to Northern Ireland for probably nearly 10 years now, almost every week. I still go regularly. No one on either side of the border, in business or politics, has ever said that presents a problem. The border is basically a tax border. It doesn't have to be an inspection point. And with modern technology, as was explained in the government's paper, confirmed by John Thompson, the head of Customs and Revenue, there are technologies that can be pre-invoicing, electronic invoicing, authorised economic operators.
OK.
Hang on.
Let me just put this to Alistair Campbell.
No, I haven't quite finished your point. This is very important. This is mainly a local economy.
I'll come back to you in a second. Alistair Campbell, I mean, he's making it sound like you've made all the problems up.
Well, the whole way through this process, people like Owen, any problem that you put forward, it's sort of waved away airily by saying this isn't really a problem. This is a genuine problem. And also this no deal, which, I mean, Owen says he does want a deal. Owen, I think, is very, very close to being in the let's just end this whole thing, walk away from the talks. If you go into the WTO, there has to be a border, because you're then going to be with two countries that have got no proper free trade arrangement at all. And how you can even contemplate that without actually understanding, you having been a Northern Ireland Secretary, the risks that that is going to pose to stability on the island of Ireland is frankly beyond me. But it's delusional to say that this circle can be squared. And what has happened in the last 24 hours is that the delusion has met with the reality of politics and the complexities that have to be addressed, and they're not being addressed.
Owen Paterson?
Complete nonsense. John Thompson, the head of the HMRC, made it quite clear in his submissions to the Brexit Committee that even if we went to WTO terms, he was relaxed that there are current measures which could be introduced. He was pressed and pressed by those of a Remainer attitude like Alistair Campbell. I've just told you, you can have electronic invoicing, you can have pre-clearance, you can have a derogation for small business on the border, running newspapers or whatever, and you have regular suppliers such as those taking milk. It's from the same farm, the same tanker, the same road, the same destination, under authorised economic operators. So we have, as an example, the UK, we have 604 authorised economic operators. Germany has 6,000. So what we need to do is to establish the end game. And where Alistair is nearly right, what I'm saying is that the EU is trying to extort more and more money. It's demanding unacceptable terms on the remit of the ECJ after we've left. And there comes a point when we say, sadly, enough is enough. You're not prepared to talk about reciprocal free trade, so we will go to WTO terms and we will prepare ourselves accordingly. And we'll go to Geneva. And that is an option which would present our partners with a real choice of really sitting down and doing a free trade deal, which is what we all want.
And that's at the point where Owen Paterson and the Brexit extremists have basically been saying the whole way through they need us more than we need them, which simply isn't true. And yesterday, Theresa May, it seems, was ready to make some kind of arrangement with the Irish government, and then has this humiliation of it, the entire thing being unplugged by the DUP, underlining the instability that this process has created in Ireland. And I just fail to see how Owen Paterson can be so sanguine when this process, I think, is actually running into the sand.
So you think there is no solution?
I put it this way, Owen can tell me, quote, all the evidence he wants that was given to a select committee. I have yet to read a piece of paper that says this is how you end the relationship between the UK and the European Union and how you settle the issue of this land border without there being a border. I have yet to see how that can be done.
Owen Paterson, how would you stop people crossing the border
Alistair, can I just say,
in great numbers or goods that don't meet the regulations? How would you check?
Alistair's talking complete nonsense. There was a paper put out by the government in the summer in real detail on how you would handle the border. And I repeat again, the most senior man on this, the man who runs HMRC...
It wasn't convincing and it wasn't accepted.
Just let me answer the point where you were talking tosh just now. HMRC have said very clearly that they are not phased and they are relaxed under real pressure for Remainer MPs to say this is all going to be a nightmare, as you're saying, and I just disagree with you. But just to go back to the earlier points, Alistair's got considerable experience of Northern Ireland. The last time we met, I think, we shared an aeroplane flying back on one of those computer planes, and we had a chat. And I have spent much time there and talked to a lot of people. And yesterday's proposal, I don't know how it got in the draft, was extremely damaging to the Belfast Agreement, which stated very clearly that Northern Ireland remains and is an integral part of the United Kingdom until there should be a border poll. There's no chance of a border poll at the moment, and therefore the same conditions, the same regulations should pertain in Northern Ireland as in any other part of the United Kingdom. The proposal that Northern Ireland is hived off was generally very damaging.
You want to stop this by stopping the whole thing?
Well, I think there has to come a point, surely, where when you see the damage that is already being done to the economy, which we saw in the budget, when you see the people working in the National Health Service saying that they are feeling the pressures, when you see defence procurement chiefs saying that because of the collapse in the value of the pound post-Brexit, that they are not able to buy some of the orders that they've been making, when you see the loss in our standing in the world, when you see the...
And how people voted in the referendum.
Well, people are entitled to change their mind. June the 23rd was not the end of our democracy. And I actually do believe that the reason why Owen Paterson and the people on the extremist wing of the debate, why they're getting a little bit desperate, I think they realise that people are changing their mind as they see the costs mounting, the chaos mounting, and the absolute total incompetence of the government's inability to deliver the Brexit that Owen, by the way, Owen, who once said that only a madman would want to leave the single market, you've never fully explained that one. How these people are driving the government over a cliff.
Got to leave it there, Owen Paterson. Thank you very much. Maybe you can explain.
Absolutely, complete, more absolute nonsense and misery from Alistair Campbell.
Well, it was just a quote.
Have record inward foreign investment. We have
no, we're not talking about that. He was asking you about the single market
quote,
thing.
He's always taken out of context. I go on to explain that it's just a market and we will always have a relationship with it.
Okay.
And I say we're not going to be like Somaliland or North Korea. And Alistair knows that jolly well.
Thank you very much. Alistair Campbell, thank you for coming.
A Brexit deal to get us to the next phase of talks didn't happen yesterday, and today there's been more drama. Theresa May is now trapped between Brexiteer MPs' desire to stop making concessions, the Taoiseach's veto over the next round of talks, and the DUP's hold over her government. Is it like the end of Reservoir Dogs? It feels like it. But at the heart of it is a trilemma. The UK government is looking for three things from which the EU says we can only have two. Britain wants no land border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. It wants no sea border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. But it wants no EU control at home. Independence from EU rules, which probably implies some kind of border between Britain and the EU. Well, the Irish say they'll not accept a breach of number one. The DUP will not tolerate a breach of number two. So does that mean we have no choice but to breach number three? Well, that's not what Ian Duncan Smith and his fellow Brexiteers want. Brexit Secretary David Davis kind of admitted that 3 is the one to look at, but in the Commons today, he thought we could still take back control even if we align many of our rules to the EU's.
The presumption of the discussion was that everything we talked about applied to the whole United Kingdom. I reiterate, alignment isn't harmonisation. It isn't having exactly the same rules. It's sometimes having mutually recognised rules, mutually recognised inspection, all of that sort of thing as well. That's what we're aiming at.
Well, can we really have a UK-wide arrangement that allows us to be different from the EU, but similar enough for Northern Ireland not to have a border? There are kind of two thoughts about this. We need a fudge in a form of words that simply gets us to the next stage of talks, and then we work out a solution properly later. Or the second thought is that we have to face the difficult choice now, as it won't go away by a carefully drafted piece of constructive ambiguity. Well, Nick Watt, our political editor, is with me. Nick, what did you make of David Davis's assertion there?
Well, those specific remarks by David Davis were meant to reassure the DUP that this idea, this new buzz phrase of regulatory alignment, would apply across the UK. Yes, there would be a Northern Ireland element, which is essentially embedding those elements of cross-border cooperation in the Good Friday Agreement. But the UK-wide element is how you deliver that regulatory alignment. And what it is about is the UK deciding what to do as a rule maker, deciding which bits of regulation to accept, not meekly accepting them from the EU as a rule taker. Now, this was not good enough for some Tory Brexiteers. I'm told after that statement, one leading figure eyeballed David Davis across the lunch table and said, "This will not do. You cannot sign up to this." So I've been looking at how this row with the DUP is now spreading into the Tory party. The season of goodwill should soon be upon us. For the moment, it all feels a bit scratchy as the government's Brexit negotiations are thrown into the air. In an ideal world, Theresa May would have hailed an EU deal with a European ally today. The pre-Christmas meeting with her Spanish counterpart still went ahead, but the Prime Minister now faces a new headache after Tory Leave supporters joined forces with the DUP to reject the proposed EU deal in its current form.
Prime Minister's bent over backwards in every way, but we've been rebuffed by the EU. I think the sense is now the EU has to go away and think again. Do they really want a trade arrangement? In which case, it's quite absurd to try and lock everything up before you actually discuss trade.
Ian Duncan-Smith took his cue from the DUP.
We want to see a sensible Brexit, and we will work through on the basis of the clear red lines that we have set down, which are, as we understand it, the red lines of the government as well. So a sensible Brexit in which the UK leaves as one nation with a sensible relationship with the rest of the EU.
Tory Brexiteers are delighted with the DUP. One told me their intervention has saved us having to rebel against the government in Parliament. Those Tories want to use the pause to try and change the pace of the negotiations. The aim is to stop the Prime Minister offering what they fear are irrevocable commitments to the EU that could not be withdrawn even if the UK is unhappy with the final deal. If that can't be done, they say simply the UK should walk away. Labour is alarmed by the new alliance between the DUP and the Tory Brexiteers.
It is grossly irresponsible to be advocating walking away from these negotiations. And I'm sure the Prime Minister isn't going to do that. The surest way to ensure a hard border in Northern Ireland is to walk away from these negotiations. It is to walk away from our responsibilities.
The current impasse over the Irish border prompted the leaders of Britain's devolved bodies to warn that the UK is facing a delicate moment. The First Minister of Wales believes the UK government would be wise to consult more widely.
We would prefer to be more closely involved in the Brexit negotiations. I think we could be constructive in terms of what we have to offer. We can, I think, provide a helping hand to the UK government. I mean, it's not about preventing Brexit, that's going to happen. But there are sensible, pragmatic people in the UK government who want there to be a Brexit that works for Britain and not some kind of hardline nationalist Brexit that some in the Conservative Party seem to want.
Amid the swirl of uncertainty, Theresa May is hoping to restore some calm. But the Prime Minister knows she faces a formidable challenge to settle this issue.
She does indeed. And Nick is still here. Nick, I mean, do you think she can get this show back on the road, particularly with this clock ticking? Really, the end of the week is the deadline.
Yes, I sense a slightly less optimistic view of meeting that unofficial deadline of sorting this by Friday. There had been a thought that the Prime Minister might go to Brussels after PMQs tomorrow. I think she will not be there before Thursday, and not even by then, possibly, because the DUP are really digging in. They are saying there have to be substantial amendments to this proposed deal with the EU. Possibly the wording stays, but if the wording stays, there needs to be lots more wording. And then really significant, they're saying, we're not accepting this deadline, even the deadline of sorting this out by the European Council next week. They're saying the EU, it can hold an emergency summit. It's done it before, so why can't it do it again? But there is a potential chink of light for the government. The DUP's red line is there must be complete, let's use our favourite word, alignment between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And if that can be achieved, then possibly Theresa May be able to win the DUP, if not many of her Tory Brexiteers.
All right, thanks, Nick. Well, while Theresa May works her way through all of this, she does so, of course, against the ticking clock of that deadline of the end of this week to reach an agreement if Britain's to unlock the next round of talks. So what's the mood in Brussels? I spoke earlier to the Dutch MEP, Sophie in 't Veld, deputy of the EU Parliament's chief negotiator, Guy Verhofstadt. And I asked whether, after David Davis said in the Commons today that the plan was always for Northern Ireland to have the same regulatory arrangements as the rest of the UK, if that was her understanding of yesterday's deal.
Well, I think that's fantastic, because that in essence means that Brexit's not going to happen. Because if there's regulatory alignment, then, you know, for a very large part, then the UK would still follow the same EU rules. It doesn't make much sense to me, but if that's what Mr. Davis proposes, that sounds very good.
But hang on, if we went down the David Davis route, regulatory alignment, would we have to have free movement as well?
Well, you know, again, we're talking about very shady proposals here. We don't know what we're actually talking about, but
well, regulatory
like alignment means that you adopt that. No, but nobody knows. Nobody knows.
Okay.
And quite honestly, you know, at some point we would also like to know exactly what it is that the UK government wants. Only once we have a clear idea of that, we can negotiate.
Can I ask whether you think there's any solution to the Northern Ireland border issue that doesn't involve a border between Britain and Northern Ireland and allows Theresa May to keep her red lines? She's spelled out some red lines. Can she keep those red lines, not have a border down the Irish Sea, and not have a border with the Republic of Ireland? Does that work in any way at all?
What we don't want is what we call a hard border.
Right.
Will there be a border? Yes, by definition there will be a border. There's a border now. The question is, how is it going to work in practice? And I think the one solution that is not going to work is what apparently the UK government has in mind, to say, okay, you know, we're not going to set up a physical border post, but we'll just put up some cameras and sensors. And no, clearly that's not going to work, because people will not accept it. But that it will have to be like a soft border, I think that is clear. Otherwise, you jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement, and it's, you know, and that would be disastrous.
You are jeopardising the Good Friday Agreement by potentially ruling out a deal with the UK that is acceptable to the UK. It takes two sides for there to be no deal, doesn't it? And if there's no deal, well, then you will want to put a border there to protect the integrity of your single market.
This is a very strange way of looking at it, and I'm also a little bit irritated that, you know, the EU is an entity that's been around for about 60 years. For over 40 years, the UK has been a member of it. The UK has been building the European Union as much as any other country. As a matter of fact, it's been you know, in the forefront building the single market. Now, the UK has chosen to leave the European Union. For the time being, it looks as if the UK also wants to leave the internal market. The UK knows, like better than anybody else, what the rules of the single market are. You've created them together with the rest of Europe.
I wonder whether you think the rest of the EU will go all the way to the wire on this issue, backing up Ireland. Ireland obviously says we've got a veto, but we don't need to use the veto because everyone is supporting us. Is everybody supporting Ireland on this?
Yes. The way I understood it, I mean, I wasn't in the room, but the way I understood it, Mrs. May made this proposition and said, okay, can we debate on this, this notion of regulatory alignment for Northern Ireland and see if that is a basis for negotiations. That was a very positive step. But then apparently she got a phone call from the DUP telling her, no, you're not. So, you know, then she also has to choose. I mean, who is in charge?
Do you have some sympathy for her predicament, though, given that she is between the Republic of Ireland that has a veto over the next stage, the DUP that is holding her government in office, and indeed the aspirations of those who voted for Brexit last year in the referendum?
Well, of course. I mean, I'm very happy I'm not in her shoes. I recognize it's very difficult, and contrary to what some of the British media are reporting, there is really nobody. I've literally met nobody in the European Parliament that is out to somehow penalise the UK. Quite the opposite. Everybody. I'm from the Netherlands. Okay, people in the Netherlands want to keep close ties with the UK, but there's a limit to what you can do. And saying, okay, you can leave the European Union. You will have access to the single market, but you don't have to abide by the rules that everybody else has to abide by. That is simply not an option, and I think you and everybody will understand that.
Sophie in 't Veld, thank you so much. Thanks for talking to us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, yesterday's deal, the one that didn't happen, was acceptable to the Irish, and it implied that come what may, when Brexit happens, Northern Ireland will not diverge from the EU in ways that might require the construction of a border. Now, as we've just heard from that interview, it seems even now some in the EU are not clear on exactly what the British plans are or what that deal might have entailed. We'll discuss all of this in a moment with a Brexit-supporting Tory MP, but first our business editor, Helen Thomas, has been trying to make sense of the options.
Here's the problem in a nutshell, or a milk bottle. Everyone wants to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, so milk can flow freely between North and South, much as it does now. Hence the proposal this week. If the UK doesn't get the broad free trade deal it wants, it would still commit to regulatory alignment, particularly in key areas like agriculture, between Northern Ireland and the South. What alignment means was left probably intentionally vague. Is it really any different from no divergence, harmonisation or equivalence? But the main message was clear. Animals and animal products wouldn't need to be checked at special border inspection posts.
Here's the first problem. The implication was that Northern Ireland could follow some single market regulations, even if the rest of the UK chose not to. Enter the DUP. To them, even that theoretical divergence between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK is totally unacceptable.
It might mean no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but instead you'd need checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Why? Well, there's our old friend, the chlorine-washed chicken. Say the UK did its much-discussed deal with the US and accepted chlorine chicken, banned by the EU. To keep that pesky poultry out would require a border check, either between Great Britain and Northern Ireland or between Northern Ireland and the Republic. But that's unacceptable, either to the DUP or the Irish. So could the UK align itself entirely with EU rules in certain key areas? No borders, but then we couldn't agree to buy US chicken. That could scupper our great plans for other trade deals.
There is another problem. Regulatory alignment isn't necessarily enough to avoid any physical borders. For that, you might need a customs union or agreeing the same set of external tariffs for goods arriving from non-EU countries. Without it, well, you're still going to need some customs checks somewhere.
Of course, the government expects to get its broader deal, but even to start talks, means a border-based fudge. The possibility of Northern Ireland having different rules from the rest of the UK, or the idea of the whole UK aligning itself with the EU longer term on regulations and customs.
Helen Thomas there. I hope you really have got the hang of the conundrum now. Well, Kwasi Kwarteng is Brexit-backing Conservative MP and the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. A very good evening to you.
Hello.
First, can I just get you to comment on what Ian Duncan-Smith said? Because he seemed ready, really, if the EU don't move, to just say, scrap it, we're going our own way, we'll go to WTO terms, we won't try and have a deal and probably not pay you much money.
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that Ian Duncan-Smith, myself, Theresa May, Ruth Davidson, we're all unionists. So this idea that somehow Northern Ireland was going to be treated differently from the rest of the UK is something that needs to be put to bed. We're all committed.
That's not going to happen.
We're all committed to having a whole nation, whole UK solution to the problem that you've outlined. Now, what I would say broadly is that there are two aspects to this. There's obviously the British government's negotiation with the EU, which I know your piece didn't reflect on it, but it's actually going quite well. The Chancellor said this morning that it was very likely there was going to be a deal. Donald Tusk
it's going very well, except that a couple of very difficult things. So rather than talk about all the successes, let's just focus on the
but you didn't mention any of the successes,
but
and I think it's very important.
It's
very important because viewers realise that the talks are going quite well.
We've got it down to the intractable end problem, and these are the ones that have not been solved because they're difficult. Now, can I ask you which you would prefer? I test your preferences. If the EU gave us a choice, would you rather there was a border between Britain and Northern Ireland, which you've just ruled out, or would you rather that Britain stayed in the single market or close to it, under ECJ, under some kind of...
Well, I reject the premises.
So you reject both of those?
No, what I'm saying is that we have two issues here. We've got a negotiation with the EU, which is going very well, but you wanted to elide that. You didn't want to do that.
No, I accept it's gone well on 90%.
And then we've got this issue with the border with Northern Ireland. Now, we were very close to a deal. The regulatory alignment formula, if you like, as the DEXU Secretary said, as David Davis said today in the House of Commons, does not mean that we have exactly the same rules. It's not the same, to use his phrase, as harmonisation. So that's something which we've got to get our heads around. And at the same time, we haven't really entered, as your clip said, we haven't really entered the main nub of the trade negotiations.
I'm trying to get that. So you're happy with what David Davis said today? You're happy that there's a degree of alignment and that we, to some extent, not as much as being in the single market, but the whole of the UK, to some extent, aligns itself.
So if you look at around the world, if you look at New Zealand and Australia, they have a degree of regulatory alignment. I mean, that's
was
the phrase.
Was this what we were sold? Can I just ask you, is this a
But these two countries, forgive me, I'm trying to answer your question, but these two countries are sovereign nations. They're not the same country.
So we've got the alignment. That is where we are, and that's you would accept that. I didn't get the feeling that Ian Duncan-Smith would accept it, but you would. But is that the Brexit that people thought they were voting for?
So the Brexit that people were voting for, broadly, which is the Brexiteer wish, is to have control of borders
and
in terms of freedom of movement.
It means that.
And I think we will deliver on that. I think there's also the issue of the court, the European Court of Justice, being superior, as it were, to British law, and I think we're going to claim sovereignty on that. And the third item was obviously the money. Now, it's clear to me on the money side, we are not going to continue paying a net contribution of 10 billion every single year till kingdom come to the EU. That's ending, and that's what was the nature of the financial settlement.
It is interesting.
On all three of those issues, I think we will deliver on Brexit.
It wasn't said in the campaign that there would be a degree of alignment. This problem seems to have come as a surprise, if you like, to the Brexit side of the argument.
No, if you spoke to Brexiteers that I did, and I was on the campaign, people were very keen that we had a free trade deal, okay? So there would be a free trade deal between the UK and the EU. Now, the nature of free trade deals, I mean, you're an economist, you understand that, is that there is some degree of regulatory alignment or compliance in free trade, and it's on that basis where you would have free trade.
And when Ian Duncan-Smith says, no deal, we could walk away, what do you think of the no-deal option? Because obviously there are differing views about how bad that would be.
I think a no-deal option is very unlikely. And I say that because I speak to the Chancellor, people in the government, and the broad Conservative
Party. But I understand that you want to deny this as difficult as I'm painting it.
Conservative Party.
But is it would it be a tragic for the UK economy, or would it be kind of, well, we'll just have to go that way if they force us?
As you know, I'm here as a Brexiteer. I campaigned on your show. I took part in debates. I've always not been very frightened of the idea of no deal. I've always said that Britain had a great future and a great ability to trade its way and to gain prosperity with no deal. But that's not something that I think is on the cards, and I think it's much more likely that we will get a deal.
OK, Kwasi Kwarteng, thanks so much. Thanks.
Thank you.